there will be no national, at least I don't believe, from what I've read
There's
and
no
all this kind of stuff,
representation
there will be
at
no
the
national
COP forum. Yeah.
representation at the table. I think it was at the Glasgow COP where right at the last second, India and China got up and fought the language around the rollback of coal and fossil fuels. And so the language was changed in terms of the phase out. If you remember of the like completely phase out. And that came because the India and China delegation was there to fight that fight. I can't remember who wrote this earlier this week. It wasn't me, but like they made the point that the US choosing to sit out on a
It
national
means they can't enforce the
conversation.
language. Yeah, for sure. And then like if they
And then they
rejoin, so, I mean, the thing is like
and
they've
then they're gonna
exited the Paris
complain.
Agreement, right? So like it's a conference of parties, and if you're not a party, then you shouldn't
You
be
don't
there, or
get a
you would be there
voice.
as an observer anyways.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Common Ground. As always, I'm your co-host Deb Ryan, and I'm joined by my co-host Teresa Hartmann. Teresa,
Hi,
how are you?
Maureen. How's
Good
it
to
going?
see you. Yeah.
Good to see you
Um,
too.
Make sure before we kick off our conversation, as always, make sure you like and subscribe to stay on top of everything we're going to talk about. Teresa, you and I have been chatting about this for a little bit. We've had a little bit of time to reflect on Climate Week. I know it's been a few weeks since the event, but we thought it was worth just kind of taking a bit of a step back and being like, what is the point of these events now? And by these events, things like Climate Week and then, COPs coming up at the end of the year that kind of mix government conversations with public and private conversations, obviously private sector, stuff like that, and the climate movement. And like, so I'm kind of curious, like, based on everything you've seen and read that came out of Climate Week in New York, kind of what's your high level takeaway about that?
Yeah, it's a tough one to be honest. So like I didn't go. I think it's the second year in a row that I didn't actually go to New York. For various reasons, right? Like I feel like it's really hard to justify like flying halfway around the globe from Europe to like get to a climate conference. And I'm just like, unless I'm going to achieve something, like there are very good reasons to go. But like unless I'm going to achieve something there that I couldn't have achieved on Zoom, I'm not gonna blow all those emissions into the air. So like I was watching it from the outside in. I was watching coverage. I don't know. Like I'm curious to hear what you think, but like my feed was full of all of these readouts about like why it was the greatest climate week ever, and like people were so excited, and there was so much like in the readout there seemed so much excitement, but like I can't really put my finger on outcomes, right? And like it's just something that's really stuck with me that like I don't feel like the conversation moved forward a huge amount. I didn't see huge commitments come out. I didn't see, like there wasn't a whole lot of like big alliances coming out of this. And that's to be expected, right? As in like the US has just pulled back from climate action. There's a ton of funding that's missing. I think really when I speak to my colleagues in the US, I get this overwhelming sense of like burnout, right? Burnout and despair, as in like a ton of people have just lost their jobs, not just in the US, also in Europe, because we were tied to US funding. So a ton of people are out of a job, and the people who are left are frankly doing four people's work, so they're just burnt out. And I'm like, I just thought that this like dichotomy between like what I was reading about how great it was and like how I feel in my conversations with people who are still in the climate movement or like still, in corporate climate action, like there was just such a gap. How did you feel about it?
It's kind of worth breaking some of that down, I think. So for me, and again, I wasn't there either. And so it was all through, again, I spoke to a number of people who I know went, and again, seeing what was on LinkedIn and reading kind of, people's takeaways from it. The thing that was interesting for me about Climate Week this year, so back when I should have been making a decision to go in like June, July kind of thing, midsummer, was really busy doing other things, that kind of stuff. And there wasn't a lot of pull for me
Mm.
to think it was worth getting on a plane and going and stuff like that. And like, to be honest, even beyond the like trying to find a hotel and all kinds of stuff, I got family in New York. So, worst case, I can just
Right,
sleep on
like
my
it didn't
couch
feel like a
and stuff.
magnet for you to like get on a plane and
It,
get yourself up there.
yeah. And yet, in the like 2 weeks leading up to Climate Week, I feel like everybody I spoke to was like, "Are you going to be in New York? Are you going to be in
It
New York? Are
became
you going
so
to be in New York?"
buzzy, right? Like
I
suddenly
was like,
everybody was buzzing to go.
no, I'm not. Because again, like you can't just 2 weeks out be like, okay, I'm going to go to Climate Week, because without, it's such a huge event. It's all over the city. It's not like it's I think for folks that haven't been, it's not like it's like in a convention center, like a traditional conference
Oh
and
no,
stuff.
no, no! It's completely dispersed, like throughout the
It's
city, like different
throughout.
venues. Like
Yeah.
we
So
always
like,
joke, you have to bring your New York running shoes because you have to get
yeah.
from like venue to venue.
And know that it's going to take you like 45 minutes on the subway or, like
And
whatever it
then you
is.
miss your dinner, or you have to skip your reception because you're stuck.
Yeah.
Like,
So
it's
it's not like
painful.
you can just choose to like, it's not like a normal conference where you can be like, okay, yeah, I'll pay my conference fee and stay at the hotel that's next
Pop
to the
up, yeah.
convention center and just go. So I was like, so I was kind of interested to sort of see what came out of it, right? Because
Yeah,
I'd had
yeah.
so many people reach out to me and be like, are you going to be there? Like,
But
are you
that's
going to be
good,
able to
right?
catch
Like
up and
that's a
stuff like that?
good sign. Like there's
Which is
still
cool.
momentum and people are still going. Like that's
Yeah,
very good.
it is. And I think the piece that you talk about with like what I can get done on Zoom, right? There's so much. You and I are recording. You're in Europe. I'm in the US right now. Like it's great that we have these tools and all this stuff to like communicate and chat to people and make things really efficient and cut out our travel time and stuff like that, which can be exhausting. But at the same time, there is benefit to getting in the same room as people and just being there and
There
like
is.
sitting
Yeah,
down either
yeah.
for panels and technical conversations or like going and grabbing a glass of wine and
You just have a whole
like
other level of trust building, right? And like it's
yeah.
energizing. Like it's nice to be like I'm in Paris right now just because I wanted to see some coworkers, right? And like
Mm.
it's energizing to get into the same space.
Yeah. So there is sort of this sort of utility, and you talk about like the burnout that your friends and colleagues and stuff are feeling and things like that. I think it's worth, I think, also taking a bit of a step back around like what what was sort of the intention of Climate Week in the first place? Because
Mm.
it always runs alongside the UN General Assembly in New York, and it was always intended to be a climate conversation alongside that to sort of bring attention to climate issues. And it's been around since like 2009, is it? I think it's a number of years.
Yeah, for ages, right? And like,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. Like, it was always that idea of like, all the heads of state are already like with their delegations, they're already in New York. And wouldn't that be a good moment to go and influence and plant ideas? And it's almost like, can you plant ideas for COP, right? Because that always comes after.
Yeah, and that's what we're in November. It's already October now. COP's in November in Brazil this year, and so it's coming up really
Yeah, it's
quickly.
super early. Yeah, much earlier than usual.
Um, the challenge, I think, with Climate Week, and from a lot of what I spoke to with folks about, and even then with the people being like, "Are you going to be there? Are you going to be there?"
Mm.
The Climate Week portion of the New York week feels very business development focused. It's about companies getting out in front of people and hosting events and
You need
again
to be
almost
seen.
yeah, like almost
You need
this
to be
like
seen to be there. Yes.
and I wonder if that's also because I saw a lot of this on LinkedIn and stuff like that as well, where people posted pictures of themselves on panels and talked about the great events that they were at and stuff like that.
It's
But
marketing, it's brand building, it's
exactly.
profile, like you're really setting the stage for yourself.
Yeah. Instead of, and I think you and I were talking about this before we jumped on, but like there is no crossover between business and country.
There
Like,
is not. There is not, right? And like if you go to a COP, so the Conference of Parties for the UNFCCC for the climate framework, you have a blue zone, which is where the delegations happen with all the government officials, and you have a green zone that's usually directly adjacent or around it, where all the non-state actors, so all the NGOs, all the businesses show up and like have their program. And what happens at a COP is that usually, I mean, it's like except for like very few venues, usually there's like great permeability, right? And like you have delegations, you have heads of state, you have ministers who like come out and take part in like discussions and bilateral meetings. They're in panels, they're in workshops, and like it really mixes at
mm,
COP. And I'm not sure that it mixes at New York Climate Week.
yep. And again, that the dispersion around the entire city, right, almost makes it impossible because the
Well,
UN
it's not
delegation's
dispersion,
not going
and
to
it's also
leave.
like who goes to UNGA, right? So like
Mm,
UNGA really is heads of state, and a lot of the time they're setting their priorities on the global stage, right? So they're going to be talking about investments, they're going to be talking about the economy, about trade. They're not there. It's not a climate venue, so it's also not representatives who work on climate, right? As in like so like you can plan
that
super high
makes sense.
level ideas with like heads of state, but there's nobody to have a technical discussion with because they don't go to UNGA, they go to
Mm,
COP.
that makes sense. It's a really interesting nuance on that. I think it's important, and because I know one of the things that we want to talk about, like a lot of the announcements and a lot of the stuff that came out of Climate Week were some of the commitments that countries made or didn't make, and So what were your kind of high level? And I know you and I, we've recorded and we can link to it. We recorded some of our takeaways on what Trump talked about, but like, what were your, so we've already covered that. We don't need to talk about that again. What were some of your takeaways from some of what the other heads of state and countries talked about?
Yeah. So this is the piece that I'm actually really excited about. And like I don't know, like to me it was like a glimmer of hope in like a really bleak climate landscape this year, right? So like we understand that there's not much moving on the sort of like private sector side and a lot of funding has broken away from the public sector side. But so what happened is that like as part of the General Assembly, the Secretary General of the UN hosted a climate action day, which he's done before years and years ago. I want to say in 2019. But so like there hasn't been one in a very long time. And he hosted this because he wanted to mobilize commitments ahead of COP, right? So like this COP, countries were meant to be submitting new NDCs and they're meant to be submitting their 2035 targets, right? So like you might have a 2050 like net zero goal, but what was missing for many, if not all countries, was that 2035 like interim target. Like how much are you going to do by, I'm just thinking 10 years from now.
Yeah, right. It was always 2030, but that's quite soon. So anyway.
Yeah, that's actually quite soon. So this was meant to be the like big political moment right ahead of COP where like heads of state are all like getting together and they will get to this climate summit and they're actually pledging, right? And like so they made all these announcements and like I was honestly, to me it was like the one ray of sunshine, was the one like piece of hope that happened in that week, was really like seeing, so like there was like 100 countries that spoke. 60 of them, I think, made new pledges. Like, they're not all submitted in writing yet, but like 60 of them made new pledges, which is outstanding. That covers, I think, something like half of global emissions. So it's not that we're all the way there, but we're so much further ahead than we were before, right? And like, and this is the crazy thing. If you look at who pledged, like Russia has new targets, China has new targets, Turkey has new targets. Like, these are all really large emitters that do not traditionally lead on the climate action stage, right? Like they're, and like, you know, just seeing that, like seeing some of the, and like, I think we talked about this in the context of the Trump announcement where we're like, well, it really remains to be seen, like, you know, with the US taking a step back from the global climate stage, it really remains to be seen how other countries step up. And I think what they did on that Wednesday, I think it was the Wednesday, was that they stepped up. Like literally they like stepped up on stage and to the microphone and went like, we will cut emissions.
So I'm curious, like one of the things that I had read about as well is that the EU's always been very proud about like leading the conversation around some of this. And it felt like they kind of took a little bit of a step back a little bit. And there seems like there's a little bit of contention between some of the EU countries around what they should be doing. And there's some tension there and stuff. Like, you're sitting in Europe, you see some of this up front. Like, what was your, particularly with these other countries, like you said, China and Turkey and even Russia and stuff stepping up and making pledges? Like, I don't know, what's kind of your thought on, it's not that the EU
Yeah,
pulled
EU
back.
targets. Yeah.
They didn't
So
pull
they
back.
hadn't agreed. It was interesting. They were trying to agree the interim target in the run up to the climate summit. They couldn't, I mean, as these things go, when you have like 27 members to agree with, like, they couldn't agree it. So they actually went on stage and said that their target, makes me smile, will be between 66 and 72% reductions as compared to like 1990 levels. So they just gave themselves this like wide range of like, we will agree, we're working on agreeing, here's the range within which we will be agreeing. So it was a bit of a like a smile moment for me. But still, you know, like really, really progressive overall, right? Like there is a pre-existing announcement to aim for a 90% reduction by 2040, which is incredibly ambitious. And like so far the EU's actually been doing well at meeting their targets. I mean, I think that there's, you know, there's ongoing discussions over, and like we have a whole episode around like deregulation in the European regulation space. Right, so like there are ongoing discussions over like, you know, should we roll back like reporting requirements, should we roll back some of the clean air standards and so on and so forth. But like for now, you know, they're still there.
Oh, and that's it. Like, it's not that they're not there. It's just, it was interesting to me to see that they weren't leading the conversation to a
Not
certain
as
extent.
much.
Yeah,
I think
not
the
in
piece
not in the
that
same way
like,
they have in the past.
yeah, no, I agree with you. Like that, not as much, which I think has to do with like, you know, all kinds of like internal turmoil at the moment over like, you know, how do we I mean, obviously like Europe is having like geopolitical troubles, right? With like Russia, not only invading Ukraine, but now also sending drones into European airspace. So that's been preoccupying leaders on the one hand. I think on the other hand, you know, like there's a very live debate over competitiveness in the EU, right? And like how
Yeah.
much regulation is appropriate to maintain competitiveness. And I think that that is, I don't want to say stymieing climate policy, but it obviously has, there's overlap with climate policy, right? Because like where are we competitive? Like it used to be the automotive industry, right? And like some of the harder to abate sectors like steel and so on. So like I think there's like a very sensitive, it's a very sensitive moment in time for the EU.
Yeah. And I don't know if I said it on our last podcast or on a different one, but like more and more, and this kind of gets to the topic that Climate Week was trying to tackle in the first place, but to your point around that balance and stuff like that, I feel like you can't have energy policy without, like, energy policy is climate policy, and
Yeah,
climate policy is also energy policy. And it's been interesting to see then when a country, like whichever one the country puts first, it still impacts the other one. And more, that's so
always
it's an
impacts the other one, right?
interesting.
And then like
Yeah.
it's like energy policy, but also like your agricultural policy is actually a climate policy, right? Like your
Yeah.
transport policy is actually a climate policy. Like all of these sectors just like have such huge footprints.
Yeah. No, it's really true, actually, stepping beyond just the energy piece and stuff. And I was focusing on the energy piece because the theme for Climate Week this year, and this is where I wonder if like some of the changes we're seeing, the theme was called Power On. And there's so many subtexts for that. The big picture piece, obviously, is the AI conversation that continues to just take over any conversation here in the US.
Right.
I and it's not that you, again, energy, the AI energy policy, and then how does that impact climate, right? And so then everybody, and I say everybody, like almost all the stuff I saw around like people talking about and at events and stuff like that still had this energy subtext to it around, okay, how do we then work with utilities, or how do we figure out, renewables, or how do we, do certifications around natural gas and all sorts of stuff. Like those conversations, at least in, again, the circles and the people that I talk to and follow and stuff like that, were very, very loud. So it's, and in light of then, again, what Trump said, but also like the EU trying to figure out this balance, and even China making the pledges they did is all about renewable solar power and China's dominance in the critical minerals and battery space. Like I'm just sort of curious as to your kind of thoughts and takeaways on that piece and that interpretation of Power On, like literally, like
The
the
AI
literal.
piece or the
Yeah.
utility piece,
Well,
or
just, yeah,
both.
the energy AI, how do we power on, and again, energy policy, like it very much, that
Yeah.
title to me for Climate Week is very much an energy conversation, not a climate conversation, in that interpretation of it. And so, which sets the tone, right, for the whole week, which I think is
Yeah.
just interesting.
It is an energy conversation. I don't know. Like, I never really like. I know, yeah. Like you and I come from slightly different backgrounds. Like, I never really think of like an energy conversation as not being a climate conversation. Certainly not in the clean energy space. I mean, I think like the number that made the headlines was that like investments into like clean technologies, right? So like grids, energy installation vehicles came to something like $2 trillion last year. So it's huge. And
Yeah.
it's actually now like not only overtaking investments into new fossil infrastructure, it's actually twice the investments that we're seeing into new fossil infrastructure. So like power on, like there literally is like we're powering forward, like despite the current like political climate, despite the geopolitical situation, despite tariffs, like we're really seeing the world like power forward on these like clean technologies, and that is because they're becoming cost competitive, right? Like it just makes sense. It also like it enhances energy independence and security in many parts of the world. It's it's just something that I actually think is unstoppable. Like I don't know if I'm being naive there, and I'd love to hear your energy engineering view on that, but like I think that the clean energy debate, like it's almost become decoupled because it's competitive now.
Yeah. I don't actually disagree. Like it's why we see China being so aggressive around, like, do I believe everything China's putting out about their goals? No. But do I believe they're making huge investments in this space? Absolutely. And it's because they've figured out how to I said, create PV cells, build electric cars, like all of this stuff now is for consumers, people like you and me, means that we can actually now make decisions about how we choose to power our lives, never mind how utilities and stuff like that are going to go about it. And particularly, solar panels is one thing, but like the infiltration of Chinese electric vehicles everywhere in the world except the US shows that like when someone has the ability to purchase a $4,000 BYD electric vehicle, or a, I don't know, 10, even, bottom of the line,
Yeah.
$10,000 ICE,
Why would you not do that?
you
Yes.
buy the $4,000 car, right? So
Yeah.
it starts to your point, like, yeah, like it starts to just, that's the economic decision that a family will make, that a company will
Yeah,
make,
like
that
especially as
whoever.
fuel prices go up, right?
Yeah,
Like all we're seeing are like geopolitical crises that are driving up fuel prices, right? Like the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, like all of these things, like what are they impacting? They're impacting fuel prices, right? So like if you can get onto renewable energy, that potentially, depending on where you live in the world, you might be able to generate yourself
yeah.
through rooftop solar. Like, why wouldn't you want to go for that, right?
Yeah. And that's the bit I go back to is, and I know we've talked about this before, but they're like wherever you are in the world, right? Like there are definitely certain places where, solar is excellent. And there are places where it's not going to work so well. And that's okay, right? Like it's, as long as we're not making promises. I say we, like the broader we, like people that live further
You and
north,
I.
are going to know that it's going to be more challenging than people that live
Yeah.
closer to the equator in terms of solar, all this kind of stuff. So it's like, it's, as long as people know what they're signing up for. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it gives.
I thought it was really interesting. You said something earlier about like you don't necessarily believe all the Chinese climate plans. Say more about that.
Um, I mean, the Chinese economy is still a very, very coal-powered economy. So yes, they're making really big strides into building out electric, um, like EV, and solar and stuff as part of their overall electricity needs. But they're still burning a huge amount of coal. I think, I
Yeah.
can't remember the exact statistics, but China alone burns something like 30% of the world's coal.
Yeah.
And so they're not getting off that anytime soon. And
Yeah. They're
as
peaking though, right? As in like the target that they've just, which you may or may not believe, but the target that they've just announced is that they'll be 7 to 10% below peak emissions in 10 years from now. So like according to like we did think earlier in the year, I actually need to look, I don't know if that was confirmed. Like we did think earlier in the year that China might have peaked its emissions already, right? Like and that would make it one of the
yeah,
first industrialized countries to peak its emissions. Which I mean they might bounce back a little bit, right? But like the intention behind the goal is to say that like they're peaking now, right? Like they're peaking before 2030. Like that's more than
yeah.
most countries can say about
And
themselves.
so, and happy to be proven wrong when we see kind of what happens and some of this kind of stuff. And they have, with their emissions trading scheme, they have put changes in place to try and figure stuff out and things like
Yeah.
that. But it is still so hard to get information and reliable information out of China
That's
about
my
some of these
question.
things. Like,
Yes.
are companies compliant with the ETS? There was early indications that that was just not a thing, right? And even the way the original carbon intensity metrics were set in the China ETS meant that it, like, because they didn't have an energy carbon intensity, they had a coal specific carbon intensity that was higher than a gas powered carbon intensity. So it still
Right.
enabled coal powered as long as they were being efficient
Right.
with their coal power and stuff. So like they
It's like, yeah,
put.
we will lower from here to there, but not all the way down to gas.
Exactly. And so they've now changed from a carbon intensity to an absolute cap, very consistent with other emissions trading schemes and stuff like that. But like, it's just, again, it's still meant that you could still build a coal-fired power plant and still be in compliance with the ETS. And then
Right.
there was a lot of reporting that companies weren't compliant with the ETS. And so it's like, so again, like it's, yes, they've got things in place, they have structure in place. And it was interesting. I mean, it was a couple of years ago now, I was presenting at a oil and gas conference in Oklahoma. Um, so, very pro oil and gas crowd. And so again, it was an oil and gas event. So everyone was in the industry and stuff. And I was talking about like what different groups around the world were doing, different countries around the world were doing. And I had a guy being like, whoa, but you said China's doing all this stuff. And I was like, and that they're going to be great. And I was like, no, to be fair, I was like, I said that they had an emissions trading scheme, like, which the US does not have. That is a true fact. But again,
Regional
like,
ones, right? But like not a full
yeah, we don't have
coverage
national, yeah.
level.
And
Yeah, yeah.
so,
California
it was
obviously
just,
has.
again, it's just, I'll be happy to be proven wrong on some of this stuff, but I
Yeah,
think, it's worth, you always have to lift under the lid a little bit with anything,
yeah,
right? Like, it doesn't matter whose climate policy or energy policy or whatever policy it is, but you know, when you sort of dove in a little bit in terms of then what was China actually doing versus what they were saying, yes,
mm-hmm.
they had an
Yeah,
ETS, but
enforcement versus target setting, right?
yeah, like, yes, they had an ETS, but yes, that it still enabled new coal fire to come on and be compliant. And then, like I said, they weren't even sort of enforcing compliance and stuff. That may change. Great. And I mean, again, with how, and I can't remember who said this. It wasn't me, and stuff, but I do agree with it. We're looking at the different strategies that different countries have taken, where China's taken we're going to build the EV, like, solar system and supply, like, they've locked down all the critical minerals, all this kind of stuff,
Mm,
versus the US is like, well, we're going to be the AI dominant
yeah,
country. And you can see how those different policies are sort of playing out right now. Like, and,
yeah,
it's sort of like when we step back with, like, the EU oil and gas focused companies versus the US focused oil and gas companies. The EU ones have said, we're going to diversify. And we saw folks like BP and Shell and everybody else start to invest in renewables. And we saw,
start to. I'm not sure how far they
no,
went,
and this is
but
what I mean.
they certainly started.
This was a couple of years ago, but you
Mm,
saw, like, Exxon and Chevron and stuff say, well,
yeah, I
we're not
know.
going to diversify, but we're going to decarbonize. And so they
Yeah,
focused on spending capital to reduce emissions just in their operations. And
yeah.
to be
And
honest,
renewables, right? Like
yeah,
still
exactly.
looking
Like,
at
they were like, we're not going to
storage.
diversify. We
Yeah.
are an oil and gas
They're not
company.
changing the company structure. They're looking at capturing some of those emissions and
Exactly.
bringing them down.
And to be honest, like, you could argue that decarbonization is the one that's winning right now, because we've seen BP and Shell and others start to divest their renewables businesses and say, okay, we tried that. That wasn't a great idea.
Yeah.
Like, stuff like that. So it's, I mean, again, so, like,
They
as
didn't
these
succeed
different
in that for
strategies
sure.
and
On the other
policies
hand, I mean,
play
I
out.
would argue that the decarbonization of your operational emissions, I mean, that only gets you so far, right? And then you
Yeah.
still have this like ginormous scope three of like how
Yeah.
the oil is being used. I think that storage, like, it's an interesting discussion. I'm not generally against storage, but like I was just looking at numbers again over like how much we're lagging behind in like investing in building out the storage capacity that we need. That is, I
CO2
was just
storage, I
reading a
mean.
number and like I need to like fact check this, but I'm gonna say it anyways. It's something like, we're gonna need $1 to $2 trillion investment a year into storage capacity, and like we're just nowhere near like CO2 storage, right? Not
Yeah.
electricity storage. And we're nowhere near that.
No, we're not at all, because it's not cost effective. And this is why, like, this is why I always go back to market mechanisms with some of this stuff, because unless there is a financial incentive for companies to invest in some of this stuff, like, then they're not going to do it voluntarily, when it, particularly at that scale. And so, and it's something I've heard from a lot of the publicly traded companies, and in conversations I've had, where it's like, the shareholders are frustrated, and this has been over the last couple of years, about irresponsible use of capital because it doesn't generate a return.
On
So,
the renewable side.
well, just for the company, like, if you just look at an oil and gas company who are the best, it doesn't matter, right? Like, company A traded on, maybe the SEC or whatever, it doesn't matter, traded somewhere. From a shareholder point of view,
Yeah,
like,
they want to see returns
they're
for
just
sure.
like, yeah, they're like, where are you spending your capital and what returns are you getting for that capital? And when,
Yeah, and like, is it all going into R&D, and is it going into R&D ideas that don't come to fruition, right? Or
exactly.
like maybe 15 years down the line might come to
Yeah.
fruition.
Whereas if the decarbonization aspect, if a company was actually then judged based on, okay, well, your emissions last year, and again, this is where I think corporate reporting is actually a really useful tool, even though a lot of people are pushing back on it. If companies have carbon reporting similar to their financial reporting, that they say, okay, last year our emissions were X, and this year we can demonstrate, because of the capital that we spent, that our emissions are now Y. And if their share price then reflected that, and they were rewarded on that would be then like you would then make these decisions and we would get faster investment in some of these things. And without that, companies are just burning capital and their shareholders get mad.
If
So
the
it's,
share price did reflect it, right? And like
yeah,
I like, does it? Like I'm
well, it doesn't now. That's the problem. Because
like
we
I
don't
just,
have, and this is because we don't have transparent
we don't
emissions
have transparent
disclosures.
reporting. We also don't have, enough like conscious capital, right? Like enough like
Yeah.
investors who are actually going to invest in something that's more climate friendly rather than less climate friendly. I don't invest in oil and gas on principle. I drive like every financial advisor mad because they're always like, like here are all the funds that don't have like weapons in them. Like give me all the funds that don't have oil and gas in them.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? Like if you're going to be deploying climate friendly capital, I don't think you're going to be deploying it into oil and gas. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah. Whereas I would argue, and again, this is our different backgrounds, right? I would
Yeah.
argue that if you can, it's not so much about not investing into fossil fuels as a shareholder. It's about figuring out on the spectrum of every fossil fuel company that's listed on the stock exchange, which one,
Yeah.
right?
Which
Like,
one? And like I would go for the one that's diversifying because I still believe that it'll pay off at
and
some
that's
point.
okay. Yeah.
It'll pay
Like,
off for the climate. I'm not sure it's going to pay off for my money, but I mean, I'm
which
obviously
isn't right. It's an interesting balance then of like, what
I'm
does that
obviously
actually mean?
foregoing certain investments already.
So it's like, so, but that is one of the big, you talk about like, and this is where, I go back to your original question about like, why am I skeptical about China? Like, it's like,
Hmm.
they've got some stuff in place. When you look under the hood, there's some caveats with some of this stuff. And so let's see. And it's again,
Quite right.
yeah. And then as we look at different strategies that, again, oil and gas companies have taken, some of those have worked and some of them haven't. And it is an evolving conversation. But again, anyway, there's a lot. We got completely,
There's a lot. There's
um,
a lot. I was just thinking we kind of went on a bit of a tangent and started talking about where we would put our personal money in terms of oil and gas companies, which is interesting. Should we do 2 minutes on like how are you feeling like coming out of Climate Week and going into COP? How are you
yeah.
feeling about COP?
Um, the thing that I really, and I say the thing I really struggle with, right? And like the US national envoy isn't going, but all the US companies will be there. And so it's a really interesting dichotomy for me where it's like,
Are we
again,
gonna
like,
put the CEO of Meta on the climate negotiations?
so like, yeah, the US has pulled out. There will be no national, at least I don't believe, from what I've read
There's
and all
no
this kind of stuff,
representation
there will be
at
no
the
national
top of the line. Yeah.
representation at the table, which I read something last week around the fact that, and it's an interesting conversation, right? Because we've seen in different, I think it was at the Glasgow COP, where right at the last second, India and China got up and fought the language around the rollback of coal and fossil fuels. And so the language was changed in terms of the phase out. If you remember of the like completely phase out versus like, and that came because the India and China delegation was there to fight
Yeah.
that fight. So by sitting out, and this was I can't remember who wrote this earlier this week. It wasn't me, but like they made the point that the US choosing to sit out on a
It
national
means they can't enforce the
conversation,
language. Yeah, for sure. And then, like, if
and
they
then like,
rejoin, I mean, the thing is, like,
and
they've
then they're going
exited
to
the Paris
complain.
Agreement, right? So, like, it's a conference of parties, and if you're not a party, then you shouldn't
You
be
don't
there,
get
or
a
you would be
voice.
there as an observer, anyways.
Yeah.
India and China haven't exited. But yeah, like whatever the language is that comes out, right? If the US then chooses to rejoin, they just have to take it as is because you can't go back and undo it.
Yeah. So it's sort of an interesting, it'll be like they're kind of the couple of things I'm looking out for in terms of like, the US is obviously all pro, we're going to export all of our energy to the world right now, and we are going to do all this stuff and energy, which from the administration's point of view means fossil fuels, but like, and yet we're voluntarily choosing to not be at the table where conversations are being made and language is being put into
Yeah,
place around.
that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it like
Yeah.
that at all because like I always think like it's such a oh my god, like it's such a strong like political signal to like not be there and for the US to withdraw and I'm always like, oh my god, that like really takes some momentum out of the process. But like your version is like a really interesting take, right? Where you're saying actually by not being at the seat, you also can't then change the way that things are done, right? As in terms of like allocation of capital or like how much money you want to put in the adaptation fund, like whatever it is that you would want to influence. You
Yep.
just can't.
And for me, like I watched that final. I was actually, it must have been Glasgow because I was in London at the time, and so I actually watched that final session live. It was on TV, so and I'd just flown in, and I was sitting in my hotel, and you could
As you
see.
do, what you
I know,
got to
as you know, like great.
Great,
Don't ask.
great.
I also don't read. I read nonfiction books. My drives my family crazy. For fun. At the beach.
Gosh,
Yeah, I'm one of those people.
yeah,
But
I'm
you could
not.
see the Chinese and the Indian delegation at the last minute running around and ensuring that that language around phase down and not phase out of the Glasgow
Yeah,
stuff was implemented. And the US is just saying we're not
we're not
gonna.
going to be there. We're not going to have that discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that's one piece. And then I think, like I said, I think the US companies will be there in force. Like, and so it's like, well, on the same kind of token, then it's like, well, what? Not that the US companies should be not allowed to go and stuff like that, but it's this challenge I have with like these events are becoming just corporate business development conferences and maybe losing a little bit. I think your point about how the COP
I think it's
groups
much more
interact a
integrated
little
cop,
bit
but yeah, I
different, but
mean, like it is still right.
yeah.
Like it's.
Anyway, what are you like? What are you kind of like?
What am I
What are you
thinking?
looking out for?
I feel much better. I said this coming in. Like I feel much better having seen sort of like the energy behind the pledges coming out of Climate Week, where I was just like, I was expecting nothing from that summit. And like that was like to me that was really uplifting. So like I would say like cautiously optimistic actually. We still have a gap, right? We always have this ambition gap between like, the 1.5 target and then like what's actually been pledged. And like I think, I was talking about well not talking about this, but like posting about this a little bit in the context of like a sustainable finance conference I was at last week, right? But like there's this interesting dichotomy of like so we have this goal of 1.5 but then we haven't allocated so and like there's obviously like a certain number of emissions that we need to reduce, well all the emissions we need to get to zero, but we haven't allocated those to countries, right? Countries then in a bottom-up approach are voluntarily pledging, and that's why we constantly have this ambition gap between like the 1.5 goal and the actual pledges. And it's a little bit in the design of the system, right? As in like theoretically, like that's a little bit more what you had in Kyoto, right? Like Kyoto, there were like there was a certain subset of countries that had binding targets that they had to meet, and then other countries had voluntary targets, right? And like that was with the idea in mind that some countries had emitted more in the past to industrialize, and that they really should decarbonize first before you could ask the same thing of developing nations. Paris doesn't have that. Everybody has a target, right? And but like those targets, like the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, like they're determined by each member state, and it never adds up, right? And just creates this like weird gap. So I'm cautiously optimistic, as in like we saw lots of pledges, we saw lots of new NDCs coming in. It's still not all of them. I think we're still missing like 130 NDCs. So it's not perfect by far. But like within a limited system, within a flawed system, I think it's and especially with the US stepping out this year, it's can I say it's not as bad as I thought it would be? That doesn't sound very hopeful.
No, that's
It's not as bad as I thought it would be.
no. Well, and to be honest, like this goes, and I say that, but like sort of goes back to the Climate Week theme, right? Power on. Like, so we didn't talk about that, but the subtext of that theme.
Oh, Rod. Yeah.
You
Keep
talked
going.
you talked about how, a lot of your friends and colleagues in the US and other places are burnt out and exhausted, and, the US has pulled out and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, just keep going. Just
Full
keep
steam
going.
ahead, power on. Yeah, that's a little
So
bit more.
it actually works on a couple of different levels with
It works really well. Thank you, Climate Week.
So I don't know if they intended that, but it's
No, it's a bunch of comms people. If you know the people who are behind Climate Week, they intended that.
so hopefully they'll enjoy that we interpreted it that way as well. So Teresa, as always, this is great. And there's lots. I mean, this conversation's obviously ongoing. It'll be interesting to see what actually happens down in Brazil next month. So yeah.
See
Great.
you very soon. Get to
See you
chat
soon.
and more stuff coming up.
Yep.